Chosen one, it is time to tell you everything because the confusion you have been carrying and the questions that never got answered, heaven does not want you living like that anymore. A clarity is being released right now about who you are, why things happened the way they did, and what is still coming for your life. Stay with these words, because what you are about to hear may be the moment the fog finally lifts. Type Amen in the comments if you are ready to receive the clarity that heaven has been preparing to release into your life. You did not land on this video by accident, and what I'm about to share is going to show you exactly why. There was a season in my life I call the fog period, not a clear crisis, just a dense confusion covering everything, where I prayed without knowing if I was heard, made decisions without knowing if they were right, and looked at my future and saw nothing but haze, until one unexpected moment, clarity began arriving not all at once but like sunlight working against morning fog, and I realized the path had always been there. The fog was in my eyes, not in the road. Drop a like right now. This simple action helps carry this message to another chosen one who needs to hear it today. Persistent confusion is almost never accidental, and the chosen one who has been living inside it for a long time without understanding why has been trying to resolve a symptom without identifying the source. Confusion has origins, specific identifiable causes that feed it and sustain it, and until those origins are addressed directly, the confusion continues regenerating itself regardless of how earnestly the person inside it prays for clarity, seeks direction, or tries to force understanding through sheer mental effort. The most common sources of spiritual confusion are not mysterious or difficult to identify once you know what to look for. The first is the presence of too many voices speaking simultaneously into the space where discernment needs to operate. The voice of family expectations, the voice of cultural definitions of success, the voice of past wounds distorting present perception, and the voice of fear performing as wisdom, all competing for the same bandwidth and collectively drowning out the one voice that carries actual direction. The second is the accumulation of unprocessed emotional wounds that act as a distorting lens on every incoming signal, bending what God is actually communicating into the shape of the person's deepest fears rather than allowing it to arrive in its actual form. The third is a set of expectations about how God communicates that prevent the chosen one from recognizing how he is actually speaking, expecting the dramatic when he is being quiet, expecting the immediate when he is being gradual, expecting the external when he is speaking internally. The chosen one who identifies which of these sources is most active in their specific experience has found the key that begins to unlock the confusion, not by eliminating the difficulty of their circumstances, but by removing the interference that has been preventing them from receiving the signal that was being transmitted all along. I was confused for a long and genuinely disorienting stretch of my life because I was operating in a noise environment that I had never learned to manage. A constant, multi-directional input of voices, expectations, opinions, and interpretations that collectively created a static so persistent and so loud that the quieter, more consistent signal of genuine divine direction was effectively inaudible beneath it. I was listening to the voice of my family's expectations about what a successful life looked like and trying to reconcile it with a sense of calling that pointed in a completely different direction. I was listening to the voice of my own wounds, which had developed a very coherent and very persuasive narrative about my limitations that sounded like honest self-assessment, but was actually the distorted perception of someone interpreting their present through the lens of past pain rather than present reality. I was listening to the voice of comparison, the constant corrosive background measurement of where I was, against where the people around me appeared to be, which produced a chronic sense of being behind that made it impossible to be genuinely present to what was actually happening in my own life and what God was actually doing in it. And beneath all of that noise, God was speaking, consistently, clearly, patiently, but I could not hear it because I had never learned to distinguish his voice from the rest of the chorus, and I had never created the conditions of intentional quiet in which his voice could be heard without competition. Clarity did not arrive when the noise stopped. It arrived when I learned to tune to the right frequency within the noise. Here is what the chosen one needs to understand about the relationship between confusion and clarity that changes how they approach the resolution of both. Clarity is not the absence of complexity. It is the ability to navigate complexity without being disoriented by it. The person who has clarity is not someone whose life has become simple or whose circumstances have become uncomplicated. They are someone who has developed the ability to hear one specific voice clearly enough to follow it, even when every other voice around them is offering a different direction. And developing that ability requires two things that most people attempt to shortcut: the deliberate reduction of the noise that does not belong in the space where discernment operates, and the consistent, patient cultivation of the sensitivity to the voice that does. The first requires honest evaluation of which inputs have been given access to the space where your direction is formed, which voices, which relationships, which media, which internal narratives have been occupying the bandwidth that genuine divine communication needs in order to be received clearly. The second requires the kind of consistent, unhurried, genuinely expectant communion with God that produces not just the occasional experience of His presence, but the developed sensitivity to His voice that makes recognition possible even in the midst of the surrounding noise that never fully disappears. The chosen one who does both of these things consistently will find that clarity is not as distant as the confusion made it seem. It was always being transmitted. The interference was the problem, and the interference is addressable. So here is the honest self-examination I am asking you to conduct, not as a theological exercise, but as a practical audit of what has been occupying the space where your discernment needs to operate. Which voices have you been allowing to speak into the formation of your direction that do not have the authority, the perspective, or the genuine investment in your actual calling that would qualify them to do so? Not which voices are loudest, which voices are most influential, most embedded in the background of your daily thinking, most consistently shaping what you believe is possible and what you believe God is saying. Because the path to clarity almost always runs through the honest identification and deliberate reduction of the specific noise that has been blocking the signal. And that process requires more courage than most people expect, because some of the noisiest voices are also the most familiar, the most loved, and the most difficult to stop listening to even when you know their frequency is wrong. Type 777 if you are ready to silence every voice that has been creating confusion and tune in to what heaven is saying. Nothing you have lived through was without purpose. Not the pain, not the mistakes, not the losses, not the relationships that ended before you were ready, not the opportunities that slipped away before you could hold them, not the years that felt like they were being consumed by circumstances, rather than invested in a direction. Heaven has a perspective on your past that is categorically different from the one that the pain of living it produced in you. And that perspective does not minimize what was genuinely hard or pretend that what hurt didn't hurt. It simply refuses to allow the difficulty of the experience to be the final word on its meaning. Every chapter of your story, including the ones you would have written differently, the ones you wish had gone another way, the ones you have carried with a weight of regret or confusion that has made them feel like evidence against, rather than ingredients of your purpose, has been seen, has been held, and has been integrated into a larger narrative that the chosen one cannot fully read from inside the chapter they are currently in. The hardest chapters are not the evidence that your story went wrong. They are frequently the chapters that contain the most essential material for what the story was always being written toward. I spent years carrying shame about specific chapters of my own history, seasons I wanted to remove from the record of my life, decisions I wished I could retroactively unmake, relationships whose endings I still rehearsed differently in my imagination years after they had concluded. And in those years of carrying that shame, I was simultaneously wondering why the areas of ministry and impact that I felt most clearly called to seemed to be inaccessible to me, why the doors that should have opened remained stubbornly closed, why the version of myself that I believed God had called me to be seemed so persistently out of reach. What I could not see from inside the shame was the connection between the two things, that the chapters I was most desperately trying to hide from were the same chapters that contained the most essential equipment for the specific calling I was most urgently trying to walk in. The experiences of failure, of loss, of navigating seasons of genuine confusion and genuine darkness were not disqualifications from the work of helping others navigate theirs. They were the primary credentials for it. The chosen one who has been through something and survived it carries an authority in speaking to others who are in the middle of that same something that no amount of theoretical knowledge or second-hand understanding could ever replicate. Heaven wants you to know something specific about your past that has the potential to completely reframe how you carry it, not just emotionally, but strategically. Your past did not define you, it equipped you. And the difference between those two things is not semantic. It is the difference between a story that concludes with what happened to you and a story that uses what happened to you as the raw material for what you are becoming. Defined means determined. It means your past gets to write the limits of your present and the ceiling of your future. Equipped means prepared. It means your past, including its most painful and most confusing chapters, has been producing in you exactly what the next season of your calling is going to require you to bring. Every wound that was genuinely healed became wisdom. Every loss that was genuinely processed became compassion. Every season of confusion that was genuinely navigated became the specific understanding that allows you to sit with someone in the middle of theirs without flinching, without rushing them toward resolution before they are ready, without pretending that the fog lifts faster than it actually does. The chosen one who receives this reframe will find that the chapters they were most ashamed of become the sources of their most significant impact, not despite what they contain, but because of it. So here is the invitation I want to extend to you about your own past, and I want you to receive it not as a platitude, but as a genuine, specific, actionable shift in how you relate to your own history. Identify the chapters you have been carrying with shame rather than with understanding, the specific seasons, decisions, relationships, or outcomes that you have been treating as evidence against yourself rather than as equipment for your purpose. And for each one, ask a different question than the one you have been asking. Instead of "Why did this happen?" ask "What did this produce?" Instead of "How do I move past this?" ask "How does this equip me?" Instead of "What does this say about me?" ask "What does this make me capable of offering to someone who is living through something similar right now?" The chosen one who makes this shift will find that the weight of their past changes character, from the heavy, static weight of shame and regret to the purposeful, dynamic weight of someone who knows that what they have been through was not wasted, and who is increasingly clear about how it is meant to be used. The present is the hardest place to see clearly, and the chosen one who can read their past with perspective and imagine their future with hope will frequently find that the present, with its unresolved pressure and unanswered questions, is where confusion attacks most effectively. The past can be analyzed with distance, the future can be held with hope, but the present requires something different, the ability to be fully inside a process without needing it to be finished before you can find peace with it. This is one of the most demanding spiritual disciplines available, and it is the one that present confusion most directly attacks. The chosen one who cannot find clarity about their present is navigating the most consequential terrain of their life with the most compromised instrument available, and decisions made from inside that compromise state compound in directions that the clearer version of themselves would have recognized as misaligned before they were ever set in motion. The most transformative question I ever learned to ask about my present circumstances was not the one that came naturally, which was always some version of "Why is this happening?" and "When will it change?" The question that changed everything was, "What is this producing?" Not "What does this mean about my future?" Not "How do I escape this as quickly as possible?" But "What is this specific experience actively producing in me right now?" The moment I started asking that question consistently, the confusion about my present began giving way to something more useful, a framework that allowed me to be present to what was happening, rather than constantly trying to escape it. The chosen one who develops this question as a genuine daily practice will find that the present, which felt like the most confusing terrain, begins to reveal itself as the most information-rich place in their entire life. Heaven wants the chosen one to know something about their present moment, that the pressure of that moment makes almost impossible to see from the inside. What is happening in your life right now is not chaos without meaning. It is process with purpose, and the distinction between those two things changes everything about how you experience being inside it. Chaos is something to be escaped as quickly as possible. Process is something to be engaged with intentionally, mined for what only it can produce. The circumstances that seem most confusing, most resistant to resolution, most stubbornly refusing to make sense, those are almost certainly the areas where God is most actively at work, producing through the specific friction of those circumstances what could not be produced any other way. The chosen one who receives this truth stops experiencing confusion as evidence of divine indifference and starts experiencing it as evidence of divine investment. So here is the practical shift I am asking you to make about your present, not as a permanent answer to every question you are carrying, but as a daily, deliberate reorientation of the question you bring to your own circumstances. The next time you find yourself inside a present moment that does not make sense, pause before reaching for the why question and ask the what question instead. What is this producing in me? What capacity is this developing that was not as fully developed before? What faith is this building that the easier version of this season would never have required and therefore never have produced? The chosen one, who consistently brings this question to their present, will find that confusion does not disappear, but it loses its power to disorient, because they have developed a relationship with the process that allows them to be present to it, rather than perpetually trying to escape it. If you have been confused about what God is doing in your life right now, type "I trust the process" down below. The future God has for the chosen one is not a slightly improved version of their current life. It is something of a fundamentally different nature, built on who they are becoming rather than who they have been, and operating at a level that the current imagination has not yet been expanded enough to fully contain. This is one of the most important things heaven wants you to know about your future, because the confusion about what is coming is frequently not the result of God withholding information, but of the chosen one trying to fit a divine destination into a human imagination that has not yet been stretched to the size of what is actually being prepared. When the container of your vision is smaller than what God intends to put in it, everything about the future feels either impossible or unrecognizable, and that mismatch between the size of the preparation and the size of the expectation produces a specific kind of confusion that no amount of additional information resolves, because the problem is not the absence of information, but the inadequacy of the framework being used to receive it. The chosen one who asks God to expand their vision rather than simply to clarify their current one will find that what was confusing about the future begins to become navigable, not because all the details become visible, but because the frame becomes large enough to hold what is actually being prepared. I carried a profoundly limited vision of my own future for years without recognizing it as a limitation, because the limitation felt like humility. I could imagine incremental improvements, slightly better circumstances, slightly more resources, slightly more recognition, but genuine transformation felt arrogant to reach for, presumptuous to expect, and spiritually irresponsible to claim with any real confidence. What I did not understand was that this limitation was not humility at all. Humility is the accurate assessment of the source of what you carry, the recognition that what you have was given rather than self-generated. What I was operating from was something different, an unexamined belief that people like me did not receive the kind of future I could feel God gesturing toward, a quiet agreement with a ceiling that I had absorbed from my environment without ever consciously choosing to accept it. When God began expanding my vision, it was uncomfortable before it was liberating, because seeing more meant being responsible for more, and responsibility for more requires the willingness to be seen failing at a higher level than you were previously failing at the lower one. The chosen one whose vision is being expanded by God will feel the discomfort of that expansion before they feel the freedom of it, and that discomfort is not a sign that the expansion is wrong. It is a sign that it is real. Heaven wants you to know that the future it has prepared for you is not in jeopardy. It has not been cancelled by the mistakes you made along the way, delayed beyond the point of recovery by the seasons that seemed to move in the wrong direction, or diminished by the years that felt like they were accumulating loss rather than building toward something. The future that God prepared was designed with full knowledge of every detour, every failure, every season of confusion, and every moment of misalignment that would characterize the journey between the promise and the fulfillment. It was not designed for the version of you that would exist if everything had gone perfectly. It was designed for the version that would exist after everything went exactly the way it actually went, including the parts that were hard, the parts that were confusing, and the parts that you are still not entirely sure how to categorize. The chosen one who receives this truth will stop carrying the anxiety that their past disqualified them from their future, and start carrying the settled confidence of someone who understands that the God who prepared the destination was fully aware of the road that would lead to it when he prepared it. So here is the invitation about your future that I want you to receive, not as permission to be irresponsible with your present, but as permission to be genuinely expectant about what is coming. Stop limiting the future to what your current imagination can produce, because your current imagination is shaped by your current experience, and your current experience is not the full picture of what God has been building toward. Ask specifically and consistently for the expansion of your vision, not for more information about the details, but for the enlargement of the frame that determines what you are capable of believing is possible for your specific life. The chosen one who prays this prayer consistently will find that over time, what seemed impossibly large begins to seem like exactly the right size, not because their circumstances changed to make it more achievable, but because their vision changed to make it more receivable. And a future that can be genuinely received in faith is a future that is already, in the most important sense, already on its way. There is something that confusion produces in the chosen one that immediate clarity never could, and understanding this is one of the most important reframes available to someone who has been carrying the weight of a prolonged season of not knowing. Immediate clarity produces answers. Sustained confusion produces something rarer and more valuable, a depth of seeking that transforms the seeker in ways that the answer alone never would have. When the answers come easily, they are processed at the level of information, received, filed, and moved past without the kind of deep integration that changes how a person actually operates. But when the answer requires sustained, persistent, genuinely costly seeking, when you have to keep returning to God with the same question across days and weeks and months without receiving the immediate resolution you are asking for, the process of seeking does something to your interior world that the answer itself could not have done. It builds a quality of faith that does not require favorable circumstances to remain functional. It develops a trust that does not depend on immediate confirmation to stay intact, and it produces an intimacy with God that is only available to people who have spent real time seeking His face in the dark. Not the performed intimacy of someone who talks about closeness with God, but the actual lived, tested intimacy of someone who kept showing up when the showing up produced no immediately visible return. The most confusing seasons of my life were simultaneously the seasons of my deepest spiritual growth, and I want to say that honestly rather than as a comfortable platitude, because the honest version is more useful than the version that sounds good. I did not experience those seasons as growth while I was inside them. I experienced them as confusion, as disorientation, as the specific frustration of someone who is genuinely trying to hear God and genuinely not hearing what they expected to hear. What I can say from the other side of those seasons is that the intimacy I developed with God during the confusion was qualitatively different from the intimacy I experienced during the seasons of clarity. During clarity, I related to God primarily as the one who was directing me, as a source of guidance that I was receiving and following. During confusion, I related to Him as the one I could not function without, as a presence I was desperately dependent on in a way that the seasons of confident forward movement had never required. And that dependency, uncomfortable as it was in the experiencing of it, produced a relationship that the easier seasons simply could not have built. The chosen one who has been in confusion has been in the specific conditions that produce the deepest spiritual roots, and deep roots are what sustain everything that is about to grow above the surface. God did not create the confusion in your life. He is not the author of the disorientation that has cost you sleep and peace, and the simple ability to move forward with the confidence that you knew where you were going. But He permitted it to continue long enough to produce what it was producing in you. And the distinction between creating and permitting is one of the most important theological distinctions the chosen one can hold about their own story. Creating would mean God designed your suffering for His purposes without regard for your experience of it. Permitting means God allowed something that was not His perfect design to continue operating in your experience, because what it was producing in you was worth the cost of the experience, worth the cost to you, which means He was not indifferent to that cost, but judged the fruit of the process to be worth it in a way that your perspective from inside the confusion could not yet see. The chosen one who can hold this distinction will be able to approach their own seasons of confusion without either blaming God for creating them or concluding that God was absent from them, recognizing instead that the same God who could have ended the confusion sooner chose not to, and that the reason for that choice is written in what the confusion produced rather than in what it cost. What did the confusion produce in you that immediate clarity would not have? This is not a rhetorical question. It is one of the most practically important questions you can answer about your own story, because the answer to it will tell you something essential about what you are now equipped to carry that you were not equipped to carry before the confusion began. The faith that doesn't require confirmation before it continues moving, that was produced by the confusion. The trust that holds steady when circumstances are arguing against it, that was produced by the confusion. The specific compassion for other people who are currently in their own fog that comes from having genuinely been in yours, that was produced by the confusion. And the intimacy with God that comes only from having sought His face persistently across a sustained season of not immediately finding the answer you were looking for, that more than anything else was produced by the confusion. The chosen one who can name these things specifically in their own life will find that the confusion, which they experienced as the place where God seemed least present, was actually one of the places where He was most actively investing in who they were becoming. Type "I found you" in the confusion in the comments if your search for answers brought you closer to God. Clarity is not a permanent state that the chosen one arrives at once and never has to actively maintain. It is something that must be cultivated, protected, and consistently renewed, because the same conditions that created the confusion in the first place do not disappear the moment clarity arrives. They remain present in the environment, and without the deliberate creation of conditions that support the continued reception of clear direction, the clarity that was received will gradually be eroded by the same noise, the same wrong voices, and the same unexamined beliefs that produced the fog in the first place. The chosen one who receives a genuine moment of clarity and then returns unchanged to the exact same environment, the exact same input sources, and the exact same internal narratives that characterize the confusion season should not be surprised when the clarity begins to fade, because clarity requires conditions to sustain it, just as much as it required conditions to receive it. Receiving clarity from heaven is the first step. Creating and protecting the environment in which that clarity can remain clear, can deepen, and can continue developing into the ongoing, reliable discernment that the next season requires is the equally important second step that most people overlook in their relief and gratitude at having finally received the clarity they were seeking. I learned what it means to protect clarity the way most people learn the most important lessons, by losing it first and then understanding, in hindsight, exactly what I had failed to do that would have prevented the loss. I received a genuine, specific, deeply settled clarity about a particular direction in my life, and within weeks of receiving it, I had allowed the input sources that surrounded me to begin eroding it. Not dramatically, not through any single conversation or circumstance that obviously undid what had been received, but gradually, through the accumulated weight of opinions that were offered without invitation, circumstances that seemed to contradict what I had received, and internal doubts that found their opening in the moments when I was tired, discouraged, or simply insufficiently guarded about what I was allowing to have access to the space where the clarity lived. The chosen one who has received something genuine from God needs to treat that reception not as a completed transaction, but as the beginning of a stewardship, the ongoing, active, deliberate work of protecting what was given from the specific threats that the environment around them will consistently present to it. Receiving clarity from heaven and keeping it requires three specific practices that need to operate simultaneously rather than sequentially. The first is intentional quiet, the deliberate, consistent creation of space in which the voice of God can continue to be heard without competition, not as an occasional spiritual retreat, but as a daily rhythm that treats the noise reduction as non-negotiable rather than as a luxury that gets crowded out when life becomes demanding. The second is consistent communion, the kind of ongoing, unhurried, genuinely expectant conversation with God that produces not just the occasional experience of direction, but the developed sensitivity to His voice that makes the maintenance of clarity possible, even in the midst of the noise that never fully disappears from the environment. The third is a curated circle, the deliberate, honest, sometimes difficult evaluation of which relationships are feeding the clarity and which are feeding the confusion, and the willingness to adjust the level of access that different voices have to the space where your direction is formed, based on what they consistently produce when they speak into it. The chosen one who builds these three practices into the structure of their daily life will find that the clarity, once received, does not have to be repeatedly rediscovered. It deepens, it develops, and it becomes the stable foundation from which the next season's decisions are made. So here is the most practical question I can ask you about the clarity that is coming. Not what are you going to do with it once you have it, But what are you going to do to protect it once you receive it? Because the answer to that question determines whether this moment of clarity becomes a turning point that sustains itself into the seasons that follow, or a temporary experience of direction that gradually fades back into the familiar fog. Identify the specific noise sources that have been most effective at creating confusion in your life. The voices, the relationships, the media inputs, the internal narratives that have most consistently occupied the space where genuine discernment needs to operate and make specific, concrete decisions about how their access to that space is going to change. The chosen one who protects their clarity with the same seriousness they brought to seeking it will find that what heaven releases does not have to be received again and again. It can be built upon, deepened, and developed into the kind of sustained, reliable, life-directing discernment that was always the intended outcome of the seeking season that preceded it. After a long season of confusion, the temptation is to wait for complete clarity before taking any step, to hold still until every question is answered, every piece is in place, and the entire path is illuminated before moving a single inch forward. But clarity from God almost never works that way, and the chosen one who waits for the full map before they are willing to move will wait indefinitely, because God gives lanterns rather than maps, enough light for the next step, not the entire journey. The most transformative clarity I ever received was not about the final destination, but about what to do today. And when I took that step, the next one was illuminated. And when I took that one, more appeared. A progressive revelation that required progressive movement to unlock, where each step of obedience was the condition that made the next piece of clarity available. God is asking you right now to act on what you already have, not to wait for what you don't yet have, not to hold your obedience hostage to a certainty that will only arrive after the obedience, but to take the next step that is visible with the faith that the step after it will become visible when you arrive at the place the first one takes you. You already know what that step is, not the whole path, the next step, and that is exactly what heaven is asking for right now. Chosen one, the fog is lifting, and what heaven came to deliver today is not an answer to every question, but something more valuable, a perspective that changes how you see everything. Your past equipped you, your present is purposeful, your future is intact, and the confusion was never abandonment. Close your eyes and say it out loud. Heaven, I receive the clarity you are releasing over my life today. The confusion ends here. I trust you with what I cannot yet see, and I take the next step in faith. Amen. If this reached you today, it wasn't by accident. Drop a like. It helps this word find another chosen one who has been carrying confusion for too long and needs the clarity heaven is releasing right now. Subscribe and turn on the bell. What's coming next is for those ready to walk in clarity, purpose, and everything heaven has been preparing to reveal in their next season. One word. Tell me what you felt. I read every single one,